Let's take a look at Psalm 4. By now you know that this is the editorial heading, and here is the actual psalm heading or title. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. So unlike Psalm 3, which gave us a historical note, this one gives us a musical note, that this was a psalm that was part of the choir master's collection, presumably because it was used in the corporate worship of ancient Israel, and that it was to be sung to the accompaniment of stringed instruments. And then we are told that it is a psalm of David, indicating David is the author. So we don't know from the heading what the context was in which this psalm was written. The opening line is a good clue that it's a lament psalm. It begins with an invocation. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. This crying out to God is a very good indication that it's a lament psalm. Now, if we read the psalm as a whole, we're going to find that it has a very strong overtone of confidence or trust. And psalms of trust or confidence are sort of a subgenre of laments because the confidence or trust is expressed in spite of the crisis that surrounds the psalm. So you could call it a psalm of confidence or trust. Most commentators classify it as a lament, and this opening invitation is a good indication that it's a lament. Let's have a quick look and see if we can figure out what is the underlying circumstance for this lament. So, answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. So, I was in distress. This past tense is probably the psalmist looking back, though. So, he's looking back and saying, in the past, when I've been in distress, you've given me relief. Therefore, in the present situation, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Here's an indication of what the current crisis might be. O men, how long shall my honor be turned to shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? Selah. So he's facing opposition from a group called O men. The underlying Hebrew phrase could well indicate that it's Bnei Ish, could well indicate that these are men of some influence and stature in the community, and they are turning his honor into shame. And they are attacking him with words, specifically lies. If we scroll a little bit further down, so we get an indication that they may be angry. And then if we go down to verse 6, he says, there are many who say, who will show us any good? So this would indicate that something of a crisis is unfolding, perhaps in the economy, perhaps there's a famine, but things are not good in the land of Israel. And it would seem like these men at the top are blaming the king, perhaps wanting to depose him, etc. Then he says, you have put more joy in my heart than when their grain and wine abound. Now that may well indicate that the crisis they're facing is some kind of a famine. There isn't an abundance of grain and wine, and the people are facing a crisis for which the king is being blamed, the king being David. One theory that I have some sympathy with, although it's speculative, is maybe this psalm shares the setting of the previous one. The attempt by Absalom and his men to overthrow David and blaming perhaps the economy, blaming him for the economy, etc., but using lies and so on to do that. But that's purely speculative. So if we reconstruct it, he's facing opposition from some influential men, and he's facing a situation where many in the land are facing a crisis, saying, who will show us any good? And it seems like their grain and wine are not abounding. So that's the broad general context. There is some kind of a crisis. And of course, it's natural to blame the king. Let's have a look at the strophes or stanzas. In a short psalm like this, they're interchangeable terms. So you can see verse 1 is presented as an introductory strophe. Then verses 2 and 3 in the ESV are seen as a strophe. You can see the small break there. Verses 4 and 5, verses 6 and 7, and then a short ending strophe in Psalm 8. So we've got 1, 2, 3. My counting isn't so good. I think we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strophes, with the opening and closing ones being particularly short. Let's work through it briefly. So it's a prayer for God's intervention. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. And sandwiched between those two exhortations for God to intervene for him, he mentions the fact that you have given me relief when I was in distress. So he can look back on his past experiences of God's deliverance as this basis for his expectation and confidence that the God of his righteousness, which is both the idea that God is righteous and the idea that he is a God who keeps his covenant with Israel. So the God of his righteousness will be gracious to him. This language of graciousness echoes perhaps the high priestly or the priestly prayer in Numbers. We'll see another echo later. Then he alludes to a big part of the crisis. O men, how long shall my honor be turned to shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? So he is being attacked by a group of influential men who are dishonoring him, probably in his role as king, and they're using vain words and lies, perhaps slander, perhaps false allegations, etc., to discredit the king. And then he says, but know. Now this is the first of a string of commands. But know, be angry, do not sin, ponder, be silent, offer right sacrifices, and trust in the Lord. So there's a string of commands. So David, having introduced that there's this opposition from these men, now sets about offering them counsel for dealing with their frustrations more constructively than by slandering him. And it's an amazing expression of restraint by an ancient king, that he is expressing that to God in prayer. So now he says to these people who are lying about him, he says, know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. Clearly the godly here is the psalmist, who is innocent of the lies being spoken against him. The Lord hears when I call to him. So again, echoing his confidence. So he wants them to know, God has put me here, I am a godly man, and he's going to hear my prayer. He's kind of saying to them, don't be silly. Now he gives them counsel for dealing with their frustrations. He says, be angry and do not sin. And there's a lot of debate about what be angry might fully mean. You can check it out in the commentaries. Some feel it means tremble. But whatever it is, it's as if he's saying, be angry. I understand that you're angry, but be careful what you do with that anger. Do not sin. Rather, ponder in your hearts on your beds and be silent. So process your frustration in a more constructive way. And then go and worship the Lord. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. This is an altogether more constructive way of dealing with your frustration over the economy, over the situation we're facing, than launching a revolution. And then perhaps he turns to the broader community and says there are many. Now, you may reason that the many are the same group of men that were referred to above, but it could be the broader frustration. There are many who say, who will show us some good? And the psalmist says, lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. This is the echo from the Numbers prayer. The Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. That was the gracious above. The Lord lift up his face or countenance upon you and give you peace. So many are saying, who's going to show us good? Who's going to help us? And the response of the men above is perhaps to try and overthrow the government. And the Lord is, and David's prayer is, Lord, you are the source. You turn towards us, be gracious to us, lift the light of your face upon us. And then he remembers God's goodness to him. You've put more joy in my heart than when their grain and wine abound. And we can remember the famous words of Habakkuk 3. Though the fig tree does not blossom and there are no grapes on the vine, yet I will hope and rejoice in the Lord. So David is trusting in God in the good times and in the bad times. And then the psalm ends with a declaration of confidence expressed as peace. In peace I will lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. So I think a psalm we can relate to in many of our political contexts this morning. The psalmist is facing the dilemma of people who want to overthrow him because they blame him as the king for the political and economic situations that make them unhappy. And yet David says, God has put me here. I'm going to sleep in peace. And he looks to the Lord as the source of their blessing.